Hello. Thanks for coming in today. It is great to meet you. I have had a chance to look over your portfolio and your resume, and it looks like you have a really solid foundation from your first couple of years in the industry. To get us started, why don't you tell me a bit about your general approach to your work and how you've been developing your skills lately?
Thanks for having me. I have really enjoyed the last 2 years. I think my general approach is to be a bridge between the artistic vision and the technical implementation. I love the creative side of VFX, but I have found that I really enjoy the puzzle-solving aspect of it. Over the last couple of years, I have focused on writing cleaner code and following established pipelines more strictly. I have realized that while it is tempting to find a quick hack to make a shot look good, that usually causes problems down the line for the compositor or the render farm. So, I have been pushing myself to be more methodical, ensuring my files are organized and my processes are reproducible. I have spent a lot of time lately diving deeper into procedural workflows and trying to understand the math behind the tools I use, so I can troubleshoot things independently rather than always having to ask a lead for help.
That is a great mindset to have, especially early in your career. Being mindful of the pipeline is half the battle. Let's dive into some technical specifics. I want to talk about texturing. In your experience, could you walk me through the process of creating a procedural texture set versus a hand-painted one? When would you choose one over the other?
Sure. Creating a procedural texture set is really about setting up a series of algorithms and mathematical rules to generate the look automatically. I use software tools to produce patterns, colors, and noise based on parameters that I define. The big advantage there is iteration speed. If a lead tells me the rust on a metal surface needs to be more concentrated in the crevices, I can just adjust a parameter or a mask rather than repainting the whole asset. It is also incredibly scalable. If I have a massive environment with a lot of repetitive surfaces, procedural textures ensure consistency without needing massive amounts of unique UV space. On the other hand, hand-painted textures are much more manual. I am using digital painting techniques, literally crafting every detail, smudge, and highlight by hand. This gives me a level of artistic control and uniqueness that you just can't get with a noise function. If I need a character's face to have a very specific scar or a piece of clothing to have a unique wear pattern that tells a story, hand painting is the way to go. The downside is that it is time-consuming and doesn't scale well. If the model's geometry changes significantly, I might have to spend hours repainting sections to fix the stretching.
Right, the trade-off between precision and flexibility. Speaking of geometry, I saw some of your modeling work. Let's talk about topology. For someone who might be new to the term, how do you describe topology and why does it actually matter in a production environment?
I usually describe topology as the arrangement and flow of the edges, vertices, and faces that make up a 3D mesh. If the mesh is the skin, the topology is like the muscle fiber and skeletal structure underneath. It determines how the surface is structured, and that is critical because it directly affects how the model deforms during animation. If you have good topology, the mesh flows logically with the movement. For example, if a character's face moves or a muscle flexes, the edges follow the natural contours of the anatomy. But if you have bad topology, you get pinching, stretching, or those unnatural distortions that pull the mesh in weird directions. It is like the framework of a sculpture. It is not just about the final shape, but how the pieces are connected. If the flow is wrong, no amount of clever weighting in the rig is going to fix it completely.
That is a good analogy. Along those lines, let's get a bit more granular. I see you use polygons obviously, but can you explain the difference between general polygon and quads? Why are we so obsessed with quads in the industry?
Right, so a polygon is basically any flat shape with 3 or more straight sides. You could have triangles, quads, pentagons, or even n-gons with 10 sides. Quads, specifically, are polygons with exactly 4 sides. The reason we prefer quads in a production pipeline is almost entirely about deformation and subdivision. Quads divide very predictably. When you apply a subdivision surface modifier, quads split evenly and maintain a smooth surface. Triangles can create artifacts, especially when they are clustered, and n-gons are a nightmare because the software has to guess how to triangulate them, which often leads to shading glitches or weird spikes in the mesh. For animation, quads are just way more stable and result in a much cleaner surface when the character is moving.
Let's move over to animation for a bit. Imagine you are reviewing a cycle and you notice some popcorning artifacts. How would you go about fixing that?
Popcorning is always frustrating because it can be so subtle until you see it in the final playblast. To me, it usually looks like sudden, unnatural jumps or a sort of flickering in the movement. My first step is always to identify the exact problematic frames. I'll scrub through the timeline slowly or, more efficiently, go straight into the graph editor. I look for irregularities in the motion curves, sudden spikes or jagged edges where the line should be a smooth arc. Once I find the glitch, I look at the interpolation. I'll smooth out the curves by adjusting the tangents or switching to a more appropriate easing function. Depending on the movement, I might move from a spline to a linear interpolation if it is a mechanical movement, or refine the spline to get rid of that overshoot. I also check the rig controls to make sure they are properly weighted and not causing a sudden snap in deformation. If it's still popping, I'll add a few more keyframes to force the path to be more consistent. Finally, I always playblast the section in real time to make sure the fix actually feels natural and doesn't just look okay in the graph editor.
Good. Now let's talk about the feel of the movement. Sometimes we have a static object or one that isn't moving much, but it needs to feel like it has weight or inertia. What techniques do you use to sell that?
That is where the classic animation principles really come in. To give a static or slow-moving object a sense of weight, I rely heavily on secondary motion, squash and stretch, and overlapping action. Secondary motion is great for adding realism. If a character stops abruptly, I'll add a subtle movement to something like a tail or a piece of clothing that continues to move after the main body has stopped. It shows that the object has mass and momentum. Squash and stretch is another big one. I'll deform the object slightly to emphasize its mass. If a heavy ball hits the ground, it doesn't just stop. It flattens slightly, which tells the viewer's brain that this object is heavy and flexible. Then there is overlapping action. I make sure different parts of the object move at slightly different times. If a flag is waving and the wind stops, the tip of the flag should keep moving for a few frames after the base has settled. Combining these three things creates the illusion of inertia, making the object feel like it exists in a physical world with gravity and mass, rather than just being a floating 3D asset.
I want to push you a bit on the technical side of animation. If you were tasked with simulating something really specific and erratic like a squirrel scampering across a backyard, how would you handle that? You can't just keyframe every single jitter, right?
Exactly, if you keyframe every single jitter, it ends up looking robotic or staccato, because humans aren't great at mimicking that level of organic randomness by hand. I would use a combination of procedural techniques and mathematical models. First, I would use Perlin noise or simplex noise. This allows me to generate smooth but organic variations in the movement patterns, so the squirrel doesn't just move in straight lines or perfect circles. It adds that jitter in a way that feels natural. Then I would implement inverse kinematics, or IK, to handle the foot placement. Since a backyard is uneven, IK ensures the paws actually hit the ground and adjust to the terrain dynamically. To get the secondary motion, like the flick of the tail or a little wobble in the torso, I'd use a mass spring system or some basic ragdoll dynamics. This way, the tail reacts to the body's movement procedurally. I would also use a state machine to manage the transitions. A squirrel doesn't just run, it darts, stops, looks around, and then darts again. The state machine, handles the logic of when to switch between these behaviors based on environmental triggers. By layering the noise for jitter, IK for grounding, physics for the tail, and a state machine for the behavior, you get a movement that feels unpredictable but believable.
That's a very comprehensive approach. Let's switch gears to rendering and lighting. Can you explain the difference between ambient occlusion and global illumination? They both deal with shadows and light, but how do they differ in practice?
Right, they both simulate light interaction, but they operate on very different levels. Ambient occlusion, or AO, is basically a shorthand for depth. It is a shading method that darkens the areas where surfaces are close together, like the corner of a room, a crease in clothing, or a tight gap between two objects. It simulates how ambient light is blocked in those tight spaces. It's not actually calculating light bounces, it's just saying, this area is occluded, so it should be darker. It's a fast way to add a lot of perceived depth and ground objects in a scene. Global illumination, or GI, is much more complex. It is a full lighting simulation that calculates how light bounces off multiple surfaces. If you have a bright red wall and a white floor, GI will simulate the light hitting the red wall and bouncing onto the floor, creating a red tint or color bleeding. It handles indirect lighting, which makes shadows softer and the overall scene feel more physically accurate. In short, AO is a localized effect used to emphasize crevices and contact, while GI is a scene-wide simulation of how light actually travels and reflects. AO is fast and efficient, while GI is computationally expensive but essential for a truly realistic look.
Which leads me naturally to ray tracing. How does that fit into this? What is it actually doing, and how does it change the final look of a render?
Ray tracing is the underlying technology that makes things like GI and realistic reflections possible. It works by literally tracing the path of light rays as they travel from the light source, bounce off surfaces, and eventually hit the camera. Because it simulates the actual physics of light, you get incredibly accurate reflections, refractions through glass or water, and physically correct shadows. Without ray tracing, we often have to rely on faking it with things like shadow maps or reflection probes, which can look flat or artificial if the camera moves. Ray tracing removes those artifacts. The final look is much more lifelike because the light behaves the way we expect it to in the real world. It turns a scene from looking like a 3D render into looking like a photograph.
Now let's talk about the heavy stuff. Volumetric rendering. When would you use that instead of standard rasterization? Can you give me an example of a VFX shot where volumetric rendering is non-negotiable?
Rasterization is the standard, fast approach. It breaks 3D objects into triangles and colors the pixels. It's perfect for solid surfaces like a character's skin or a building. But rasterization struggles with things that aren't solid. Volumetric rendering is used for semi-transparent or diffuse materials, things like smoke, fog, clouds, or fire. Instead of calculating a flat surface, it calculates how light interacts with a volume of particles or density. It simulates how light scatters, absorbs, or glows inside that volume. A perfect example would be a shot of God rays shining through a dusty attic or mist rolling through a forest. If you try to do that with flat textures or simple particle sprites, it looks like 2D planes sliding over each other. It lacks depth. With volumetric rendering, the light actually interacts with the air in the scene, creating those beautiful shafts of light and a sense of thickness in the atmosphere. You need it whenever the medium itself, the air or the smoke, is a key part of the visual story.
Let's move into compositing. Green screen keying is a staple, but it's not always a magic button. What are the primary limitations you run into when keying a green screen?
The biggest limitation is always the quality of the source footage and the lighting. For a key to be clean, the green needs to be distinct from the subject and, more importantly, evenly lit. If there are hot spots or deep shadows on the green screen, the keyer has to work much harder, and you often end up with noise or chatter around the edges. Another huge issue is spill. That is when the green light bounces off the screen and onto the subject's skin or clothes, giving them a green tint. Removing that spill without destroying the natural colors of the subject can be a real challenge. Then there's the problem of transparency, like hair or glass. Keying out the green from between strands of hair without making the hair look like a solid block or too thin requires a lot of fine-tuning and often a combination of different keying passes.
When you're in the compositing phase and you want to add that final bit of polish, you might use chromatic aberration or edge blending. When would you use one over the other?
They serve completely different purposes. I use chromatic aberration to mimic the imperfections of a real camera lens. In the real world, lenses don't focus all colors at the exact same point, which causes a subtle color fringing, usually red and blue, around high-contrast edges. If I have a perfectly clean CGI element, it can look too perfect and therefore fake. Adding a tiny bit of chromatic aberration breaks that digital perfection and makes it feel like it was captured through a lens. Edge blending, on the other hand, is a utility tool for seamless integration. I use it when I am merging two different layers or projected images. If there is a visible seam where a foreground element meets a background, or where two different plates overlap, I use edge blending to soften those transitions. While chromatic aberration is about adding a stylized imperfection for realism, edge blending is about removing technical flaws to maintain visual continuity.
Let's go back to the art of animation, specifically frame-by-frame painted animation. How do you ensure temporal coherence? How do you stop the image from flickering or jumping between frames?
Temporal coherence is all about consistency over time. In painted animation, the biggest risk is that every frame is a new drawing, so the colors, lighting, and shapes can shift slightly, which causes that jarring flickering effect. To prevent this, I always use the previous and next frames as a direct reference. I don't just eyeball it, I use onion skinning. In software like Photoshop or TV Paint, onion skinning lets me see a faint overlay of the surrounding frames, so I can align my new drawing precisely with the existing motion path. I also try to keep my lighting and color palettes locked. If a character is moving through a scene, I make sure the light source remains constant across the sequence. Finally, I'm careful not to make too many drastic changes in shape or position between two consecutive frames. If the jump is too big, it feels like a glitch rather than a movement.
I want to touch on something more advanced. You mentioned rigs earlier. If you were designing a character rig that needs to handle both extreme actions, say a high-intensity martial arts sequence and very subtle emotional microexpressions, how would you structure that?
I would use a layered approach to separate the broad mechanical movement from the fine expressive detail. I'd start with a robust skeletal hierarchy for the body. For the martial arts stuff, I'd rely on inverse kinematics for the limbs and maybe some spline-based controls for the spine to allow for those deep arches and twists without the mesh collapsing. For the face, I would create a secondary layer of controls. I'd use a combination of blend shapes and direct manipulation rigs. The key is to ensure these facial controls are independent of the body's motion. I would implement space switching, which allows the facial controls to follow the head's movement perfectly while still being adjustable on their own. I would also build in corrective shapes, basically helper blend shapes that trigger automatically when a joint reaches a certain angle, to prevent the skin from pinching during those extreme poses. By having these distinct layers, the animator can focus on the big action first and then go back and layer in the microexpressions without worrying that a facial tweak will break the body's pose.
Speaking of the face, you mentioned blend shapes. Why use those instead of just using a lot of small bones for facial deformation?
Bones are great for structural movement, like rotating the jaw or tilting the head. But they really struggle with the organic, squishy nature of a human face. If you try to make a smile using only bones, you often get this weird mechanical stretching where the skin looks like it's being pulled by a string. Blend shapes allow you to sculpt the actual expression directly on the mesh. I can craft the exact way a cheek puffs up, or how the skin wrinkles around the eyes during a squint. It captures the nuance of a real human expression. Plus, blend shapes are much easier to layer. I can have a smile shape and a raised eyebrow shape, and I can blend them together at different percentages to create a complex emotion. With bones, you're often fighting the weights of the mesh to get that same result, and it's much less intuitive.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's pivot to performance capture and deepfakes for a moment. When you are capturing a facial performance, there are the obvious data points where the mouth is, where the eyes are. But what are the non-visible data points you try to account for to make it feel human?
That is where the uncanny valley usually happens. The non-visible data points are the psychological and physiological markers. One of the biggest is acting intent. It is the emotional motivation behind the move. A smile caused by genuine happiness looks different from a smile caused by nervousness, even if the mouth moves to the same position. I also look for microexpressions, those tiny, split-second flickers of emotion that happen before a person consciously controls their face. Then there are the physiological things: breathing patterns, the slight tension in the jaw when someone is stressed, or even how the moisture levels in the eyes change. Capturing these requires more than just basic markers. It often involves high-frequency tracking or machine learning models that can infer the internal emotional state from these tiny external cues. The goal is to capture the soul of the performance, not just the geometry of the face.
Interesting. Let's wrap up with a couple of workflow and pipeline questions. You're dealing with a very complex scene, maybe an explosion, a main character, and a lot of environmental debris. How do you manage the performance budget without killing the artistic intent?
It is all about prioritization and strategic simplification. I start by identifying what the hero of the shot is. If the focus is on the character's reaction to the explosion, then the character's face gets the highest detail and the most complex shaders. The explosion in the background, while visually impressive, can be optimized. I use level of detail, or LOD techniques. Objects far from the camera get simplified geometry and lower resolution textures. I also optimize my shaders, removing complex calculations from elements that are blurred by motion or obscured by smoke. I make it a point to collaborate with the director and the technical lead early on to set hard limits, like maximum polygon counts or texture memory caps. I also use profiling software frequently to find the actual bottlenecks. If I see that the transparency in the smoke is what is killing the render time, I can adjust the sampling or the resolution of the volumetric grid without changing the overall look. The goal is to spend the performance budget where it is most visible to the audience.
Last question for you. I've seen the term null object used in a lot of your project notes. For the sake of completeness, can you explain what a null object is and how you typically use one in your animation workflow?
A null object is essentially an invisible placeholder. It doesn't render in the final frame, and it has no geometry of its own. It is basically just a point in 3D space with its own transform data: position, rotation, and scale. I use them as handles or anchors for other objects. For example, if I have a complex group of objects that all need to rotate around a single center point, I'll parent them all to a null object and then just animate the null. It's much cleaner than trying to adjust the pivot point of every individual object. They are also incredibly useful for constraints. I can make a camera look at a null object, and then I can move that null around to control the camera's gaze without actually having to touch the camera's complex animation curves. It just keeps the scene organized and makes the rigging much more flexible.
This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate how you're able to connect the high-level artistic goals with the technical how-to. You've clearly spent your first 2 years building a very practical and professional foundation. Do you have any questions for me about the team or the current projects we're working on?
I do. I'm curious about how your team handles the handoff between the animation and compositing departments. Do you use a very rigid pipeline with a lot of pre-approved templates, or is there more room for the artists to collaborate and iterate across departments?
That's a great question. We actually use a hybrid approach. We have a strong set of standards to ensure that files don't break when they move between departments, but we encourage cross-pollination. Our animators often sit in on the comp reviews so they can see how their work is being integrated and make adjustments if something isn't reading right in the final composite.
That sounds ideal. I've found that the best results usually come when the departments are talking to each other rather than just tossing files over a wall.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time today. We will be in touch very soon regarding the next steps.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.